In a quiet bakery run by Emily, a kind-hearted woman in her late 20s, a mysterious young man named Luke appears, seeking refuge and work. As Emily welcomes him, she uncovers secrets tied to her powerful father's past and learns that Luke is the half-brother she never knew, abandoned and betrayed. Tensions rise when the truth surfaces, pushing the family to confront guilt, forgiveness, and the struggle to reconnect. Can they rebuild what was broken? Or will old wounds prove too deep to heal? Will Luke find the acceptance he craves, or will their pasts tear them apart once more? Rain tapped steadily against the bakery window as Emily closed up for the night, her eyes fixed on the quiet street outside. She'd noticed a new face lately, young, disheveled, always lurking by the doorway just before closing. Tonight, he was there again, his worn jacket soaked through, clutching a few crumpled bills in his hand. Emily felt a familiar tug of pity as she watched him linger, hesitant, glancing nervously through the glass. Just as she turned to lock the door, he stepped inside, bringing the cold with him. The man looked barely older than her, maybe 23, but his eyes held a haunted look that aged him. His skin, a warm brown like her own, was paler than it should have been, as if he hadn't seen enough sun or a warm meal in days. She noticed his hands shaking slightly as he counted the coins in his palm, head down, barely meeting her gaze. "Could I? Just a roll?" His voice was barely a whisper, scratchy from exhaustion. Emily glanced at the basket with the day's last rolls and felt a pang of sorrow. She knew too well what hunger looked like. "No need to pay. Here." She took a clean paper bag, adding a couple of pastries along with the roll. "Take these too. Fresh in the morning, but still good." He looked up, his eyes wide with surprise, then quickly looked away as if ashamed. "Thank you," he murmured, clutching the bag close. He turned to leave, but something held him back. He looked back at her, uncertainty warring with a flicker of hope. "Could I help you clean up or something? To pay you back?" Emily tilted her head, taking him in. There was a desperate edge to his offer that touched something in her. She nodded. "All right, you can start with the tables." She handed him a cloth, watching him set to work with a quiet diligence. His name was Luke, he told her, a stranger with no place to go and no family. Emily didn't ask for more details, sensing that whatever had brought him here was too raw, too painful to share yet. Over the next few weeks, a quiet routine grew between them. Each night, Luke would arrive just before closing, and they would work side by side in silence, Emily giving him food as he swept and wiped. He never complained, always finishing his work with care, almost as if afraid to leave any trace behind. One evening, as he helped her clean a shelf behind the counter, he froze, his gaze locked on a faded photo on the wall. Emily noticed his reaction and paused. "You okay?" Luke's face had gone pale, his hands trembling slightly. Who is that?" he asked, pointing to the photo. It was a simple picture of Emily's family, a younger version of her with her parents, their faces all alight with smiles. "My dad," Emily said, a bit confused by his reaction. "Why?" Luke's face tightened as he fought to control his breathing. "No reason," he said quickly, turning away. But Emily noticed the way he lingered, his eyes drawn back to the photo, with an expression that was equal parts longing and fear. She tried to shake off the moment, but it stayed with her, a strange feeling that something was off. Why had he reacted that way? And why did he always seem so familiar, as if she'd seen his face somewhere before? Days passed, but the unease grew, settling in her mind like a shadow. Emily could feel a question forming, but she wasn't sure how to ask, and Luke, with his silence, seemed to hold answers he couldn't reveal. That night, as she was closing up and Luke was sweeping, she finally decided to push a little. "You seem to know my dad, or at least you recognize him," she said gently, watching his reaction closely. Luke's face tensed, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It's nothing. Just, he reminds me of someone." But his voice was thick, betraying a depth of emotion he couldn't quite hide. Emily watched him, torn between pressing him further and respecting his privacy. "What brought you here, Luke?" she asked softly, hoping he would let her in. But he only shook his head, retreating back into his silence. Yet, as he left that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding a secret, something that ran deeper than mere recognition, something connected to her, to her family, in ways she couldn't yet understand. The days turned into weeks, and Luke became a quiet but constant presence in Emily's life. His arrival each evening brought a comfort Emily hadn't anticipated, though they rarely spoke about anything personal. He remained as elusive as ever, never volunteering details about his past, his family, or where he went after he left the bakery each night. And Emily, sensing the fragility of their connection, refrained from pushing. But there was something undeniable in the way he looked at her family photo on the wall, a flicker of emotion that grew harder for him to conceal with each passing day. She noticed the small signs, a quick glance, the way his expression softened, the faint quiver of his lip whenever her father's face came into view. It gnawed at her, this mystery surrounding Luke. Why did he have such a strong reaction, and what was he hiding? One evening, after a particularly quiet night, Emily couldn't resist any longer. She approached him as he was wiping down the counters, her voice gentle but insistent. "Luke, it's all right if you don't want to talk about it, but if there's something you need to say, something you want to share, I'm here." She reached out, resting a hand on his arm. Luke looked at her, something raw and unguarded flickering in his eyes. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then quickly shut it, his face clouding with regret. He shook his head, his gaze falling to the floor. "Thank you, Emily, but I can't." The words seemed forced, as if they hurt to say. Frustrated but unwilling to push him away, Emily sighed and gave him a small smile. "All right, just know that you can trust me. You don't have to carry it alone." After that, their nights returned to the usual silence, but a new tension simmered beneath the surface. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Luke's past was tangled with her own family's story, that he was tied to her father in some way she couldn't yet understand. A few nights later, her father, Mr. Fairbanks, made an unexpected appearance at the bakery. He was a tall, imposing figure with a confident stride, his face showing only faint lines of age. Emily had seen less of him in recent years, as he was often away on business, managing the family's extensive holdings and rarely visiting her modest little bakery. But tonight, he strode in just as Luke was mopping the floors, his sharp gaze sweeping over the scene with a hint of disapproval. "Emily," he said, his voice warm yet formal. "I just came by to check in. Thought I'd see how you're doing." His gaze slid toward Luke, who was standing awkwardly by the mop bucket, his face turned slightly away. "This is Luke," Emily said, introducing him. "He helps out here in the evenings." Her father's face tightened slightly as he took in Luke's appearance, and an almost imperceptible flicker of recognition passed over his face. He nodded curtly, his tone turning cold. "I see. Well, I hope you're not being too generous with strangers, Emily. You never know what people might be hiding." Luke's hands clenched around the mop handle, and Emily could see the strain in his posture. She felt a surge of anger toward her father's attitude, but held her tongue, not wanting to provoke a confrontation. "I'm very careful, Dad," she replied firmly, meeting his gaze. "And I know who I can trust." Mr. Fairbanks's gaze lingered on Luke a moment longer before he turned back to her, a faint frown creasing his brow. "Just be mindful. I didn't work this hard to see you waste your kindness on people who may not deserve it." He glanced one last time at Luke before striding toward the door. As soon as he was gone, Emily turned to Luke, her frustration bubbling over. "I'm sorry about that. He can be difficult." Luke shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "It's fine. I'm used to it." But something in his expression told her that her father's words had cut deep, leaving old scars she hadn't known were there. The encounter with her father only deepened Emily's curiosity. She spent sleepless nights replaying the scene, trying to piece together what she'd seen in both men's expressions. Why had her father seemed to recognize Luke? And why had Luke reacted with such pain? She decided she couldn't ignore it any longer. She needed answers. One evening, while Luke was in the back stacking boxes, she decided to search through some old family records, hoping to find anything that might explain the strange connection. In a box marked Family Keepsakes, she found photos and documents she hadn't seen in years. As she sifted through, her hands fell upon a faded birth certificate. Her eyes widened as she read the name. Luke Fairbanks. Her mind spun as she looked at the date, the place of birth. Everything confirmed her worst suspicions. Luke was her father's son, her half-brother. Emily's heart pounded as she folded the paper, struggling to process the revelation. She felt a mixture of shock, betrayal, and sadness for the life her brother had endured. He had been abandoned, cast aside like a family secret, left to fend for himself while she had grown up with the security and love of their father. It was too much to take in, yet she knew she had to confront him. She approached Luke that night as he was putting on his jacket to leave. "Luke, wait," she said, her voice barely steady. He turned to her, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" Emily swallowed hard, holding out the birth certificate. "I found this. It says that you're my brother." Luke's face pale, his hands shaking as he took the paper. He closed his eyes as though bracing himself for the impact of her words. "I didn't want you to find out this way," he murmured, his voice laced with a painful honesty. "I didn't know if I'd ever tell you. I was abandoned, Emily, thrown out like I didn't matter." Emily's throat tightened, her own emotions raw and overwhelming. "I'm so sorry, Luke. I didn't know. I can't believe he would do this." Luke looked at her, a mixture of anger and sadness in his eyes. "I've spent my whole life hating him for it, and then I found you, someone who seemed so different. I wanted to know you. I just didn't want you to know the truth." They stood in silence, the weight of their shared pain heavy between them. Finally, Emily reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You matter to me, Luke. No matter what he did, you're my brother, and that means something." Luke's face softened, and for the first time since she'd met him, he allowed himself to show a flicker of hope. Yet Emily knew this was only the beginning. Confronting their father would be the next challenge, a test of loyalty, truth, and forgiveness that would demand all the courage they both possessed. The following day, Emily awoke with a newfound determination. The revelation of her connection to Luke gnawed at her, demanding action. She knew she couldn't ignore it. There was a truth that needed to be addressed, and it wouldn't come easily. It was time to confront her father, to demand answers for why he had hidden her brother's existence and abandoned him to a life of hardship. She was prepared for a fight, though the very thought made her stomach churn. That evening, she asked Luke to meet her at the bakery after hours. When he arrived, his face was a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. "Why are we here so late?" he asked, glancing around the empty shop. "We're not alone," she said, her voice steady but laced with tension. Luke's gaze followed hers, landing on the tall, imposing figure of Mr. Fairbanks standing near the counter. Her father's face held its usual stern look, but tonight there was a shadow of something else, perhaps guilt or apprehension. Luke's body went rigid, his eyes narrowing. "What's he doing here?" His voice was tight, brimming with old hurt and anger. Emily placed a hand on his arm, hoping to calm him. "I thought it was time we all had a conversation." Mr. Fairbanks shifted, uncomfortable under his son's gaze. "Emily, I'm not sure what you're hoping to accomplish here." His voice was firm, but she could see cracks in his composure. She had rarely seen her father out of his element, and tonight he looked almost vulnerable. "What I want is for you to tell me the truth," she replied, her voice unwavering. "You owe both of us that much." Mr. Fairbanks let out a weary sigh, glancing at the door as if he could escape. But Emily blocked his path, her arms folded and her gaze unyielding. Reluctantly, he nodded, finally facing Luke with a mixture of guilt and shame. "All right then," he began, his voice softer than usual. "I suppose I owe you an explanation, both of you." As Mr. Fairbanks spoke, his voice was tinged with a remorse that surprised both siblings. He explained how, many years ago, he had fallen in love with a woman from a different background, a relationship he had hidden from his family and the society they moved in. When Luke was born, the pressure to protect his reputation and maintain the family's social standing had overwhelmed him. He had done what he thought was necessary, convincing himself it was the right thing to do, though the decision haunted him. "I'm not proud of it," he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "But I was a coward. I chose comfort over conscience, and you paid the price for it." He looked at Luke, his eyes filled with regret. "I failed you, and I've been living with that failure every day." Luke's hands clenched, his jaw tight as he fought back the emotions boiling within him. "Do you have any idea what it was like?" His voice shook with the weight of years of hurt and anger. "Do you have any idea what you put me through, all because I didn't fit into your picture-perfect world?" Mr. Fairbanks met his gaze, and for a moment, his expression softened. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I need you to know that I regret it deeply. I was wrong, and I've lost so much because of it." He paused, looking at both of them. "You, Luke, and the chance to be a real family with both of my children." Emily watched the exchange, her heart aching as she took in the vulnerability of both men. She could see the pain in Luke's face, the anger and resentment he had carried for so long, but she also sensed the tiniest crack in his armor, the faintest glimmer of a desire to heal, to find some kind of peace. "Luke," she said softly, stepping closer to him, Maybe we can start fresh. Maybe this can be a beginning." He shook his head, torn between the anger he'd harbored for so long and the faint hope Emily's words stirred. "I don't know if I can forgive him," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget." Mr. Fairbanks lowered his head, accepting the possibility that his son's forgiveness might never come. "I understand," he said, his voice resigned. "But if there's any chance at all, I want to try." Emily could see the struggle on Luke's face, the battle between hurt and hope. And just when she thought he might turn away, he looked at her, his gaze softening. Maybe for you, Emily, I can try." In the days that followed, an uneasy truce settled between Luke and his father. Mr. Fairbanks began visiting the bakery regularly, working alongside Emily and Luke, learning the simple tasks he had once dismissed as beneath him. The three of them worked in silence, each gesture careful, each word tentative. It was a delicate balance, one that could shatter with a single wrong move, but they persevered. One afternoon, as the bakery buzzed with customers, an older woman approached Luke, recognizing him from a previous night's shift. She complimented him on his kindness, recalling how he had helped her carry her purchases to her car. Mr. Fairbanks, overhearing, seemed surprised, as though seeing his son's kindness for the first time. Luke noticed his father's reaction, a flicker of pride in his eyes, and something shifted within him. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder if his father's remorse was real, if perhaps he truly regretted his actions. It was a small crack in the wall he had built, but it was enough for hope to slip through. The tension finally came to a head one evening after closing, when Mr. Fairbanks found Luke sweeping up crumbs in the quiet bakery. The older man stood nearby, watching him work, his expression unreadable. After a long silence, he spoke. "You remind me of your mother," he said quietly. "She had that same kindness, that same strength. I was a fool to leave her and you behind." Luke looked up, his eyes hard. "Do you think saying that now changes anything?" Mr. Fairbanks shook his head. "No, I don't expect it to. I just wanted you to know that. I see it now. I see you, Luke. And I'm proud of the man you've become, despite me." Something inside Luke softened, a barrier he hadn't realized he'd been holding on to. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of anger loosening, slipping away. "I can't forget what you did," he said, his voice steady but gentler. "But maybe I can forgive." Mr. Fairbanks's eyes filled with gratitude, and he nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, son. That's all I could hope for." As the weeks passed, the three of them grew closer, forming a fragile but growing bond. They became a family in their own way, each of them slowly healing, learning to trust and rely on one another. The bakery became a place of laughter, of quiet moments shared over cups of coffee and early morning baking sessions. On a quiet Sunday morning, as they opened the bakery doors, Emily looked around at her family with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She reached out, squeezing both Luke's and her father's hands. "This is our beginning," she said, smiling. "And I'm glad we're here together." Luke nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "Me too." For the first time in years, they felt whole, united by forgiveness and the courage to start anew. The bakery flourished in the weeks that followed, its once modest walls now humming with the warmth of family and a steady stream of loyal customers. Emily had taken to hanging more photos on the walls, adding moments captured during their journey to becoming a family again. Pictures of her, Luke and their father working side by side, laughing over a botched recipe, or caught mid-conversation as they shared a quiet cup of coffee before opening. One morning, Luke noticed a customer lingering by the wall, her gaze fixed on a particular photo of him and Mr. Fairbanks, both covered in flour and laughing. The woman turned to him with a gentle smile. "This place has a special feeling. You're lucky to have such a beautiful family." Luke nodded, a soft smile tugging at his lips. He no longer flinched at the word family. "Yeah," he replied, glancing toward Emily and his father at the counter. "I think we finally are." As the months passed, the fragile bond between Luke and Mr. Fairbanks grew stronger. They weren't without their disagreements, nor were old wounds entirely forgotten. But something in their relationship had softened. The respect they once held at arm's length was now spoken, even shown in small ways, Luke learning to bake his father's favorite cookies, and Mr. Fairbanks clearing his schedule for their morning delivery. They each came to value the things they'd missed for so long. One afternoon, the town organized a small food festival, inviting local businesses to set up stalls along the main street. Emily saw it as the perfect opportunity for the bakery to reach new customers. She, Luke, and their father worked through the night, preparing the best pastries they had to offer, putting together a colorful display that drew a steady crowd. Luke noticed his father standing at the edge of the stall, watching as he handed out samples to a group of young children. The older man's face was filled with pride, something Luke hadn't seen directed at him before. Mr. Fairbanks moved beside him, clearing his throat. "You've done well, Luke. This bakery wouldn't be the same without you." Luke paused, struck by the sincerity in his father's word. He felt the lingering bitterness melt away, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. "Thank you, Dad," he replied, meeting his father's gaze. It was the first time he'd called him that, and from the look on Mr. Fairbanks's face, it meant more than either of them could express. The festival was a resounding success, and in the following weeks, their bakery saw an influx of new customers. Word had spread about the warmth and kindness at Fairbanks & Co. as they'd decided to rename the bakery. Emily had suggested the name, a tribute to the family they had become. And to her surprise, Luke hadn't objected. Life settled into a new rhythm, one marked by morning rushes, shared meals, and quiet moments after closing when they'd sit together, recounting the day's stories. Emily watched her family heal and grow closer, and she found herself profoundly grateful for the journey that had brought them here. One evening, as they were closing up, Mr. Fairbanks took a small wrapped box from his coat pocket and handed it to Luke. "I meant to give you this a long time ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Luke took the box, his curiosity piqued. Inside was a watch, its face weathered with age, but still gleaming. "It was my father's," Mr. Fairbanks explained. "He gave it to me when I was young, and I always intended to pass it on to my son. I know I failed you, Luke, but I hope you can carry this now, knowing I'm proud of who you are." Luke's throat tightened as he took the watch, its weight a symbol of the years and love lost, yet somehow found again. He looked up at his father, the words sticking in his throat. "Thank you," he managed, his voice choked with emotion. He fastened the watch around his wrist, feeling a warmth and acceptance he hadn't thought possible. Emily, standing nearby, watched the exchange, her own heart swelling with gratitude. She stepped closer, wrapping an arm around Luke's shoulder. "We made it," she whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. And for the first time, Luke allowed himself to believe that they had indeed found their way back to each other. In the months that followed, the bakery became a community hub, a place where people came not only for the pastries, but for the warmth of the family that ran it. Each morning, Emily and Luke opened the doors with pride, greeting customers with smiles that spoke of resilience and healing. They had transformed the bakery into more than just a business. It was a testament to forgiveness, love, and the family they had fought so hard to reclaim. One summer afternoon, as they were closing up, a group of young kids approached the counter, their faces full of excitement. One of them looked up at Luke, his eyes shining. "Is it true that this bakery used to be just yours, Miss Emily, and that you found your brother here?" Emily and Luke exchanged a look, smiling. "It's true," Emily said, leaning over the counter. Sometimes family shows up when you least expect it. Luke nodded, his hand brushing the watch on his wrist, a constant reminder of where he had come from and where he was now. And sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness to change everything. The kids left, chattering among themselves, and Emily turned to Luke, a quiet joy in her eyes. "I'm so glad we found each other," she said softly. Luke smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. "Me too, Em. Me too." They locked up the bakery, the last rays of sunlight casting a warm glow across the sign that bore their name, Fairbanks & Co. As they walked down the quiet street, side by side, they knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with love, laughter, and the strength of a family bound not only by blood, but by forgiveness and resilience. Thank you for watching this journey of love, forgiveness, and family. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to HeroKind Stories for more inspiring tales. Don't forget to share this story with someone who needs a reminder that family is sometimes found in the most unexpected places. And if you're ready for more, check out the next video appearing on your screen now. Click and let the next story lift your spirit.